Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome back. Can you believe it? We're already in February, so 2024 is ticking right along. But we're just definitely just kicking in high gear and speeding through the new year. And I hope everyone's doing okay and that you're safe, happy, and healthy, and you're enjoying the start to the new year, and gearing up for I guess Valentine's Day is right around the corner, so that's exciting if you celebrate those commercial holidays like that. So but anyhow, I want to definitely dive right in here and get into our show. So last week, you heard me. We did a podcast, or actually the week before last now might have been. We had a podcast on male-centered women. This week, I thought I would talk about female-centered men. Okay. All right. And so, when I talked about male-centered women, I talked a lot about how women put men up on a pedestal and they seek their validation, and they just sort of make men into these godlike figures, and they just, everything they do is for the approval of a man, and a man can do no wrong in their eyes. For a man who is female centered, it happens a little bit differently. And now, while you might hear a man who is female centered say that he loves women, in all actuality, he typically does not. And what do I mean when I say that? Whenever men have issues with women, you want to look to the relationship that a man has with his mother. Very similar, with women who have issues with men, you want to look at the issues that they have with their fathers, right? And you can also look to the other parent too, or the other parental figure, or guardian figure as well. You could look at the surrounding relationships, but you want to look at the parent, or at least the parental guardian relationships that folks have with that. And a lot of times with men who are female centered, they do not have a good relationship with their mothers. And while they may have a superficially healthy relationship with their mothers, oftentimes once you dig deeper, you find out that there's some deeply rooted pain and trauma that he has not been able to work through. And with men who stay connected to toxic mothers, they oftentimes overcompensate for that. And so on the outset, it may look like he has a good relationship with his mother, but on the inside, what that looks like is a lot of inner turmoil, a lot of hatred, and a lot of deep-seated resentment that he may have. Men who have issues with their mother have typically experienced abuse and or neglect from their mother starting at a young age in childhood. They may have experienced a push-pull dynamic where their mother may have been absent or neglected them emotionally and physically for long periods of time, or may have been verbally or physically or even sexually abusive towards them. But the push-pull dynamic comes in when a parent, a mother figure is abusive towards them, but may also demonstrate acts of kindness or love, which can cause them to be confused and also constantly cause them to want to chase love, and affection from their mothers. So if their mothers were cold, but may have shown them like glimmers of like, I can be affectionate or I can be loving, but it's very rare or it's on special occasions, but you've seen signs of it. Or maybe they haven't seen signs of it and they long for it. Um, they just long to have that connection or some semblance of love in a relationship with their mother. And they will constantly chase after that, romanticize that, or fantasize about that. And, you know, in the dating world, now and I think I've talked about this on another episode of the podcast, maybe a few episodes back. There are people who talk a lot about love languages, and I love languages for me are kind of an icky conversation, and if you're not careful, it can be tricky to navigate because it can also be a way to, if an abusive person wants insight into things to withhold from you or triggers or ways to get you to destruct. You may be giving them the handbook to do so by talking about love languages. And so in today's dating world, when a lot of men talk about dating, when they're dating, one of the things that they talk about in love language is their love language is physical touch or words of affirmations. So if you look at the opposite of the love language let you name. So, for example, if you physical touch is your love language, if you never get physical touch, that could be, the cause of your demise, right? That's a way of suffering is like, I've never had physical touch. And so oftentimes when you don't get that, which is why I say I would kind of steer away from that in today's dating world, but if you don't get that, that can feel incredibly bothersome and hurtful to you, right? And same thing with words of affirmation. And I think a lot of times with men, when they talk about these are my love languages, and this isn't all men, so I want to be clear about that. But for a lot of men, when they tell you that, I think they're naming some things that they may not have gotten from their mother or things that they long for from their mother. So if their mothers aren't affectionate, if their mothers don't say, I love you, or validate them, or give them words of affirmation, oftentimes that is very telling. When someone says that they're also needing, that physical touch is their love language, also, um, it could also be a way of, how can I put this? It also might be indicative that someone may have a sex addiction. Again, I don't want to say that that's a broad stroke and applies to every man, but a lot of times men who have sex addiction will oftentimes say that their love language is physical touch. So any type of sex addiction from porn addiction to other types of addiction as well. So just want to put that out there, but a lot of times those um the love languages and also the love deprivations is what I like to call it, the opposite end of the spectrum from love languages that oftentimes stems from a relationship or inadequacy of a relationship that a man has with his mother. And so when we don't get our needs met, when men don't get their needs met by their mother, it doesn't mean that they don't still idolize or feel some sense of obligation or duty to be a son to their mother or provide for their mother or be there for their mother. It just means that underneath that, they can actually have feelings of hatred, resentment, confusion, longingness to be in a deeper connection, and so on and so forth. There's so many complicated feelings that go beyond that. But where this comes into play with how men view women is a lot of the feelings that a man will have towards his mother, in particular, if those feelings are not, if he hasn't tapped into them, or if he hasn't gone through therapy and done any sort of emotional work around them. And sometimes, even if you have, these feelings and these experiences can be multi layered and run deep to your core. But those feelings, love, longing to connect, hatred, resentment, and things like that. If those feelings aren't dealt with, and aren't healed, they will project those feelings onto women. And so how this plays out into the real world, I'm going to give you some examples of that. And also, one quick note that while I'm thinking about it, some of the stuff I did tap into on the Boys to Men series of A Date with Darkness, which I did in 2023. So you could definitely go check out the Boys to Men series for further information on that. Okay, so number one of the ways that this plays out is in effective communication skills or ineffective communication skills. So, men oftentimes will have challenges with communicating their needs to their mother, in particular, if they are still afraid of their mother, if their mother was abusive to them, or if their mother was neglectful and she's not really invested in her child's thoughts or feelings. This also translates into not being able to effectively communicate about thoughts and feelings, challenges, and needs and things like that in relationships, or working through challenges that may come up with your partner, or with other women. And so, because you've internalized and you've learned very early on that, the main woman in your life doesn't want to hear you or will not make space to hear you. Or if you communicate, she may lash out at you, or there may be some sort of steep consequence for you verbalizing how you feel. And so many men internalize their feelings, and they may sort of, uh, they're not able to externalize or communicate thoughts, feelings, needs, wants, desires. Um, and they're still in a relationship with a person who shuts things down or is just not emotionally available. They tend to internalize that. And when you internalize feelings, especially strong feelings, hatred, anger, resentment, frustrations, things like that, or even just wanting to be seen, a lot of times that can come out in ways that are very self-destructive. And I can't tell you, I worked with, and I've talked about this quite a bit. I've worked with a number of men in corrections, in private practice, probation and pretrial, and so on and so forth. And I can't tell you how many men that I've worked with that engage in self-destructive behaviors. So that can be things like cutting, that can be things like burning, um, eating disorders, or things like that, or just sort of hitting themselves and things like that. And also, too, one of the things that I think is a method of self harm that I think society is kind of, they don't really look at it as self-harm. It's seen as cool or self-expression or artistic, but I actually think as a method of self-harm is tattooing. And so tattooing, because there's needle, there's pain and things like that. That's often something that is very rampant in jails and prison systems. And when people get them in like very painful places, and they can be very elaborate, and eccentric tattoos, but also very painful. And people, a lot of times, will get addicted to that pain that comes with tattooing. And so, while it may be seen as self expression, I also look at it as a form of self harm. And people oftentimes engage in that because they can't express themselves emotionally or self harm in general because they can't express themselves emotionally or expressing themselves emotionally feels uncomfortable or feels foreign because it was something that was never allowed. And so, there's something about um, that feeling of pain that just allows them to just sort of release their emotions physically, and it becomes easier to just release their emotions physically. The same thing can also be said with someone who has a sexual addiction. And I don't want to go too far into this, but with men who have sex addiction, a lot of times, what you will notice again with, love making or being sexual with a man who has an addiction, they're oftentimes are not very emotional expressive. They don't have a lot of conversation around sexual etiquette, consent, feelings, and desires, or if they do, it's very minimal. And the other thing that you may notice with a man who has a sex addiction or who has some traits on the spectrum of narcissism is a lot of times you know, they'll have sex with you, and that's the only time they may be intimate or touching or loving towards you. But then after sex is done, they completely disconnect and disengage. You get like next to no emotion or no connection from them. They're not really talking about anything. And, one of the big things that a lot of people talk about is aftercare, which is like cuddling and like being vulnerable and being naked together in bed. And a lot of times they will push you away and go to the opposite side of the bed or leave the room altogether, and they don't spend that time bonding. And so there's not a lot of communication, but there's also more importantly, not a lot of bonding and connection. And part of that is because they're not used to connecting, being close, and being vulnerable. And so while they may actually enjoy or express enjoyment in having sex with you, it will almost feel like they don't, or like there's a huge disconnect because there's a lack of vulnerability there. And it seems so very mechanical. It's almost like, wow, it's like wham bam, thank you, ma'am, and I'm gone. And if I'm not physically gone, then mentally I'm gone. And it's almost like I'm physically not there. And so that may also happen too. Again, this is a man who may not be affectionate in a number of other ways or overly affectionate, right? If he's centered on women, women become sexual objects, their disposal. And it's not something that they really know how to connect with because they were never really taught connection, or the connection that they were taught was abusive. It was abusive and maladaptive connection. And so it's not one, the connections that they form with women on an intimacy level are usually ones where it's like, what can you do for me? What need can you meet for me? How can you validate me? They look for women to boost their ego, and it makes them feel good. The more women that are there to boost their ego, and you can boost egos by conversations, you can boost ego by sex, you can boost egos by living together, by giving money, being there to listen to problems and things like that. But very often, when you are there as an ego boost, you are not getting anything in return from this man. And he may say, "Oh, I have all these women friends, I have all these connections with women." But what you will often see is that he's very emotionally immature or stunted. So he can't have conversations and connections can only go so far, but usually, if you are the woman, there is a lot of carrying that you have to do or overlooking that you have to do in that relationship because the conversations can be so emotionally stunted. And they're very one-sided, meaning that he's looking, when a man is looking or seeking that validation for himself, he often will not give that back, or it will be so low and so minimal. It will be very much a breadcrumb. And so a breadcrumb when you seem starved for connection or you seem starved or when you're starved for attention or any sort of morsel can seem like something when you're getting nothing from a person most of the time. And so one of the other ways where men validate women, men who center women how they show up is to the outward world, they appear to sort of pander to women and put women up on a pedestal and, just have all of these things to say superficially and to the public, but behind the mask or the facade, they're not really a provider for women. They're not really a protector for women. They're not really an advocate for women. If anything, again, like I was saying before, they most of the time may use women and pull energy from women to support themselves. And so, again, they may be looking for women who can help get them jobs or give them money or give them status or things like that. And so they may surround themselves with women and appear to have relationships with women. But again, I want to reiterate that those relationships are one sided. And a man who also centers women will oftentimes chase women and or create a dynamic where there's push pull. And so I say all of that to say when a man chases women, he's oftentimes a master manipulator. He is oftentimes a cheater, and he looks for women to chase him as well. And I want to point out that so far, the men that I'm talking about, are those who portray themselves to be heterosexual to the outside world, but and try to appear to be heteronormative. But a lot of times they may also struggle with their own sexuality as well, and they may present as homophobic. Um, or have a distaste for any alternative sexual lifestyle, with the exception of polygyny or polyamory or something like that, something where they feel like they are benefiting more than anyone else. But outwardly, they put on appearances as though, they love women and they put women up on a pedestal, and that's the lifestyle, a heteronormative lifestyle. It's a lifestyle that they support and that they portray outwardly. When, again, behind closed doors, they may engage in alternative lifestyles, which, again, can be a facade even to the person that they're with, and who they also too may think that they're in a mutually exclusive heterosexual relationship, but in fact, they are not. Um, and so a man who centers women will may engage in having affairs with multiple women and having not being honest about his intentions in relationships. And so he may be what's called a womanizer, where he's entertaining multiple women, even if he's married, or in an exclusive relationship, but has a family, but he's definitely entertaining multiple women there. A man who centers women oftentimes will have challenges with finances, and oftentimes the challenges with finances often comes challenges with sex. Those are the two things because a man who has trouble with managing emotions usually lacks self control and lacks self discipline. And he will oftentimes lack self control and discipline with women and with finances. And oftentimes as a result of that, it's indicative that he has challenges around managing emotions, especially negative emotions like anger, frustration, sadness, and other emotions, fear and things like that. Negative emotions are very hard for him to manage and keep control of. And a lot of times, there is very limited expression of positive emotions like happiness, joy, fulfillment, um, feeling ecstatic, things like that. Women centered men or men who are women-centered, I should say, very often have very few, if any, deep connections with other men. So a lot of times they don't have any deep bonding relationships with other men. If they do have relationships with other men, because other men, are intimidating to them or perceived as a threat to them, or a lot of times they like to live their lifestyle in secrecy. But if they do have connections with other men, those connections are oftentimes superficial or are based around chasing women or sexualizing women or things like that. Those relationships are very superficial. So it could be, just like almost like a bravado relationship, like almost like, oh, let me show you how cool I can be by securing women, by having material goods or things like that. So relationships are often a means to compete, get bravado, or get validation for, some of the things that they're doing, but they're not deep relationships or mentorships where it's like your behavior is being checked, is being called out. Someone has expectations of you to do better or to be great men, and so a lot of times they will shy away from that, and they will stick to, the superficiality of relationships, or it's like, oh, you're cool, man. You're cool if you do this. You're cool if you do that type of thing. That's the other thing. So men who center women also too, although they may not have a great connection with their mother, the way that their mother shows up when they have a new relationship that they're committed to or are attempting to be committed to with another woman, that their mother often becomes a point of contention and or competition with that woman. What I mean by that is because a man is still chasing validation from his mother, whenever he gets into a relationship or gets married, his mother will still be the priority. And so how that looks is he will still give his mother money. He will still be at his a mother's beck and call. Um, you know, Whenever his mother comes to town, like he will roll out the red carpet for her, or she can have access to whatever she wants. And so she's actually prioritized over the relationship that he has with his significant other, which automatically puts the significant other in competition because they can't even discuss his prioritization of his mother, and it's like, "Okay, well, can we discuss when it's a convenient time for her to come visit? Can we discuss how much money you're sending her?" And things like that, and he won't even discuss it, and I think a good example or a good representation of this is, Pedro and Chantel from 90 Day Fiancé, or The Family Chantel. His mother and his sister always came first, and he always sort of he sent them stuff home, back home to the Dominican Republic, even though, he didn't really have a lot of money and he basically didn't treat his wife at home very well. But, anytime his mother called, anytime she wanted something, anytime she had some need met, she expected him to jump. And he said, how high, essentially, because he's still chasing that validation from his mother and his sister to the point where it was ruining his marriage, or his relationship. And he's still pouring into that because he's not wanting to discuss that challenge. And he felt like his wife should just jump on board with how he's acting towards her and not have a problem with it. And so, and him and his mother didn't even really have a good relationship. Pedro is a good example of they don't have a good close relationship. But again, as you can see from the show, there was a lot of conflict and discord there. But he just sort of jumped, whenever she needed him, out of that sense of obligation, out of that sense of wanting to be a dutiful son. So much so that you put being a good husband or a good partner or paying attention to your partner's needs, that falls to the wayside there. Men who center women also want to appeal to a lot of women. And the way that they want to appeal, to a lot of women is by being very aesthetically pleasing on the outside. So, a lot of times, men who are seeking that validation from women and want to really attract the eye of a lot of women, they are. They're spending a lot of time in the gym on diet or exercise, or they're spending time on material goods, trying to have a good looking outwardly appearance. And that becomes their whole persona in a sense, to where they're wearing these tight muscle shirts or, things like that, where they appear to be super buff, or, just super in shape and working out. And I'm sure that, if you've been online dating, then I'm sure that, a lot of you have seen men who take pictures of themselves in the gym. And again, that's a way that they try to be aesthetically pleasing, and, all their whole life is centered around working out and appearing to be physically fit because they feel like women want someone that is, all about fitness and exercise and is uber healthy. And so they will do all these things to be a pleasing, sexually pleasing, attractively pleasing to the eye, if that makes sense. And there's often more time spent focusing on the superficial outward appearance, than there is in working on the core values or even the challenges, that they have with women, so to speak. Lastly, what I will say is men who center women oftentimes describe themselves or will refer to themselves as a good guy. I love women. I'm a good guy. I'm a nice guy. And I usually tell people, if you hear that, you need to run. If you're a woman and a guy says that to you, you need to run the other way, because usually when they say that, they are quite the opposite. They are not a good guy. They are, in fact, your worst nightmare, and that's in disguise. And that means usually when a guy is trying so hard and saying that he's a good guy, usually they can, turn your world upside down emotionally, financially, psychologically. And in fact, they can feel very jealous of a woman's success. They can feel very threatened by, a woman in their life having good things, and feel like, um, start to feel, like, why should they have that? Why should they have that success? And subconsciously don't like, you to have those things, or they feel like those are things that they deserve, not you. And that success is rightfully theirs. And so that's where you get into predatory behaviors and people who want to, harm women and abuse women or use them for things like that. So, if you hear a man refer to himself as a nice guy, um, he is in fact a nice guy, because I'm going to tell you, a real nice guy, it shows up in his character, in his everyday life. He doesn't have to sort of, call himself that like a badge of honor or, assign that to his like label or anything. You don't really need to say those things. And so when someone's saying that out loud, what they're really trying to do is convince you to trust them, trust what they're telling you and not what they do. And what you need to be doing is actually paying attention to their actions, and their character and what their core values are, because that's usually going to tell a much different narrative. All right, guys. So that's all I have for today. I hope that this episode has been helpful. And, drop some comments if you have some other thoughts about men who center women or some other things in there that you've noticed about men who center women. They oftentimes have a big ego, very braggadocious, and they have something to prove. And the way that ego gets fed is usually by using and abusing women. So there you go. I hope that that's been helpful. And you guys definitely leave a comment, like, share, subscribe. Love to hear your thoughts. And until next time, you guys stay out of trouble and be well. Take care now. Bye bye.